the thing that I always tell students is that make your passion your profession. Like, be happy with what you do. But we really focused on like trying to get students who were, to think about the marine and coastal sciences as an opportunity, especially when they come from communities where that's not typically, one, going to college is not typically what you do, or two, going into the sciences is not typically what you do. We really started that because we wanted to encourage students to do that.
This episode is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Tidal Influence, a Californian ecological consulting firm who proudly supports environmental education and all of the diverse conservation efforts that Pelecanus works to highlight. Visit their website at tidal.influence.com to learn more about what they do to conserve our coastal resources and how you can get involved. On this episode of Conservation Conversations, we talk with Dr. Davin Holen, an associate professor and coastal community resilience specialist with the Alaska Sea Grant and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We talk about coastal resilience throughout the whole of Alaska, which has more coastline than the lower 48 combined, and a diverse variety of communities, so he has his work cut out for him. So please enjoy our conversation with Davin. Dr. Davin Holen, thank you so much for joining us. We are really excited to have you. I'm excited to talk about Alaska and all the different things you've done. So if you don't mind, can you please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Davin Holen. I'm a coastal community resilience specialist for Alaska Sea Grant and an associate professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I live in Anchorage here on Dena'ina or Dena'ina territory. This is actually where I'm from. My family's been here a few generations, so here in the South Central, I was born and raised here in Anchorage and also in Wasilla, just north of here. And I continue to reside here and spend my time here. So I'm deeply connected to Alaska and really care about our issues that we have here in the state. And I am by training an anthropologist, and I've studied mainly over the course of my career. I spent most of my time studying subsistence fisheries across Alaska and working in rural communities across Alaska to try and understand the subsistence way of life, intersection of that and culture. And over time, I've become really interested in how the climate has been impacting that way of life. So currently, I now work for the university, and that's the work I do.
I was looking at it, and as we've talked about, this is going to be part of our coastal resiliency series. So, and again, we've talked about like the hard science of coastal resiliency and like biodiversity, all those things, but also talk to people that are doing kind of community resilience. And so it kind of sounds like we're going to be right in the middle here, which is great. Mm-hmm. You said that you are a part of the Alaska Sea Grant. I looked that up, and I still don't really understand what it is. Can you talk a little bit about what the Alaska Sea Grant is?
Sure. So there are 35 Sea Grant programs around the country, and I actually a lot of my work, I work with a lot of other programs. We have some very similar issues, and so Sea Grant is a collaboration between NOAA here in Alaska and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And so that's why I mentioned I live in Anchorage, but I work for the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But our Sea Grant program is statewide. And so we have Sea Grant, what we call agents, Marine Advisory Program agents, as well as specialists like myself who focus on specific topics and address those topics statewide. And so we have faculty and staff spread from Nome in the north all the way to Petersburg in Southeast Alaska along the coast. We have several people in Juneau, several people in Kodiak, as well as quite a few people here in Anchorage, which is the hub for the state.
So is it more of a research organization, or are you kind of doing like research in action, or like the studies in action? Like how do we what's actually happening, but then how do we adjust it? Is it mostly research?
Yes and no. Sea Grant has multiple different kind of tools that we use. Most of us do what we call extension. We work with the public. We provide resources to the public. For example, I do a lot of workshops where we bring together different perspectives from different communities and focus on a certain topic. We also do education. So we have an education specialist, for example, down at Valdez, and who works with classrooms, also works with the tourist community and those people working in the tourism to educate them on Alaska and our issues. And then we also do research and fund research. So one thing I forgot to mention is that for education, most of our research projects also have a graduate student on the project, and that's one of our requirements, so that we do have some education. We also have what we call the Alaska Sea Grant State Fellows Program. We get masters and postmasters and post PhD students who are just coming out of their career, and they're trying to understand. They can do a year fellowship with us in marine policy. And one of the cool things is that, along with some of my colleagues in other programs, we established the Community Engaged Fellowship for undergraduate students, which helps get undergraduate students really interested in the marine and coastal sciences and puts them either working with tribes or with community organizations, with faculty at universities, to try to do something that's really place-based and working with their community. And doing science. And hopefully our goal with that is to encourage those students to go on to graduate degrees and go on to someday become our colleagues.
Alaska's a perfect place to do it. You've got so much coastline, and it's, I want to get into a couple of things that you mentioned, like the workshops and subsistence fisheries, but at first, I think we kind of have to take a step back and talk about Alaska, because it's so far north. There's so much coastline that I think, I don't know, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of feels like, given where it is and the issues we're having with climate, it kind of is almost like a canary in the coal mine, where it's like we're seeing what could happen in other places.
One thing to understand about Alaska is that, so we have more coastline than the rest of the United States put together. But we also have far fewer communities. So there are about 700,000 people in the state of Alaska. Most of those people live in South Central Alaska, where I'm located. But we have, for example, we have somewhere around 290 tribes, depending on how you count it, federally recognized across the state. 40% of the federally recognized tribes in the United States are here in Alaska. A lot of them are on coastlines and rivers. The other thing to understand is that Alaska is so geographically diverse. So we have Southeast Alaska, which is like, and I've worked in all these places and environments, and that's one thing that makes it so fascinating. Is, for example, Southeast Alaska is, there's lots of tribes there. They are very, you definitely notice the presence in Tlingit and Haida iconography and language, and everything is part of that community. They have a strong presence, and there's also this like really rich culture there of fishing and using coastal resources, for example, as well as the rainforest environment. And that rainforest environment is somewhere just, in the wintertime it snows, but it's just like close to freezing. So it's kind of like the northwest coast of the United States, but it's also not, because it's somewhere like between there and Alaska. So it's very different. But then you get to South Central Alaska, like here, and we live in a boreal forest environment. We have cold winters. nice summers. Then you go to the interior where it's really cold in the winter, but they also have very warm summers. And then you get to the coast of Alaska, which is somewhere in between. And so all of these environments are so different. Rainforest environments to boreal forest to Arctic tundra. There are 22 different distinct indigenous languages spoken in Alaska. And those are a mix of Yupik, Inupiaq, Athabascan, Tlingit, Eyak, and Haida peoples, as well as Alutiiq, Aleut, and others. And so, we have this like rich diversity across the state, and so those places are just so different, and the politics in each one is different because of the indigenous communities that are there. They all approach things differently, and so it's the thing about mentioned like the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the global of the planet, and so our extremes are different. And so when we do get changes that are happening, it's rapid, and it's actually visible. And the interesting thing about here is, like, I was raised in a very conservative area of Alaska, but people still believe in climate change because they see it. They actually see what's happening. Now, what's causing it is a different question, but there's no denying the fact that it's happening, because we've seen our warming waters, more ocean acidification. We've seen significant land loss in Western Alaska. The permafrost is thawing all across Alaska, which is really disrupting the landscape. And even in my lifetime, I've worked in communities like in Bristol Bay in Southwest Alaska, where I've seen Arctic tundra, massive caribou herds. All of those caribou have really disappeared, and now there's boreal forest environment there, and it's more moose habitat. So, that has happened in just my lifetime of the last 25 years of working in that region. So these kind of changes are happening all across the state, and we're kind of watching it in real time as it happens. In like I said, I've only been doing this research for like 25 years. And in that time, I've definitely seen a difference in how communities are approaching that, the ecosystems that are rapidly changing. All of those things are happening very quickly here.
I think, given the biodiversity, but also the diversity of communities, both indigenous and not, I kind of wanted to go back to what you mentioned about the workshops. So you talked that you do these workshops, and I guess what is the point of the workshops? Is that to kind of just bring people together so everyone that's are in different communities can talk?
For me, it's all about the conversation.
Yeah.
I create space for conversation to take place, and I create space for sharing of knowledge. So I'll give you a few examples. One of the workshop series that we did as part of a larger national Sea Grant effort by quite a few of us was called People on the Move in a Changing Climate. And it's a NSF funded project, part of their Coastlines and Peoples initiative. And we got something called a Research Coordination Network grant. And it was basically build a state of knowledge of places where people in the United States are moving from and where they're moving to. And as we experience more extreme events, how is this happening? Alaska has a lot of things in common with other places. Some of the work I do is through a couple of different initiatives by the National Academy of Science. I sat on a Gulf Health and Resilience Board. We did a knowledge exchange workshop series between the Gulf and Alaska, looking at mainly, besides doing this kind of work, I also do disaster science and looking at technological disasters, mainly oil spills, because they also impact communities. But, one thing you learn is that both places have fisheries. They have strong indigenous community presence. They're both Western Alaska and and the Gulf are experiencing significant land loss. There's displacement of communities. There's extreme storms. All of these things are impacting communities in the same way. And so we create avenues for sharing across those spaces. And so we did a series like that. We had a workshop in Anchorage where we brought together not just people from Alaska, but we also brought people from the Pacific Islands to actually share in that conversation. So we had communities in Western Alaska. We had a strong presence from Molokai, for example, which has a large indigenous, Native Hawaiian presence, and have them have a conversation about some of these things that are happening between their two places. But the goal really was just to create a discussion and a dialogue and to explore some of those kind of ideas. One of the last workshops we held, which was one of my favorites, was we brought 5 communities from Western Alaska and the Canadian Arctic together. So I'm a mix of extension and research for the university. So I focus a lot on research that informs my extension activities. So things I can do in research to make products and collaborations and research that benefits communities. And that's a lot of my focus. And so some of these research activities I've done across the Arctic, mainly funded by funding from Canada and Norway and others, we've looked broadly across the Arctic at things that are impacting communities. And one of the projects workshops we recently did was to bring together these 5 communities from Western Alaska and the Canadian Arctic to talk about adapting in place. We recognize that it's going to be very difficult, and we've learned it's really problematic to actually move communities in a way that is not disruptive to the community itself. And so there are lots of steps the community has to go to move. And it takes years and years and years of planning, and it also takes years of actually moving, and it takes, hundreds of millions of dollars to move a community, even of just a few hundred people. So we've learned that, and one of the things that we like to do is think proactively about how we can build resilience in communities in a really positive way. So, what we did is we brought these communities together, and we kind of shared some of the successes that each is having, and share those successes across these different places so they can learn from one another and to really just create a conversation. And that one was really fun because instead of the panels and discussions and things like that, we focused on bringing in dance, and we had a Yupik dance group come and lead us through dance and song and ceremony. We focused around food and just conversation, and we let the participants drive kind of how they wanted to actually address the workshop itself. And so everyone's very different. From these really formal type of things to something very informal that just creates conversation and allows for sharing of culture and knowledge.
That sounds awesome because it's very grassroots. It's not researchers from outside coming in like, hey, here's how you're gonna adapt. And I can imagine as these coastal communities, and whether they're indigenous communities or mixed or whatever, you guys are kind of having to adapt on, like you said, in real time. So like, what kind of strategies have you guys employed that have worked, and what are the ones that you guys have employed that maybe quite didn't? Or
so the method that we use that we've come up with over time is we have a website called Adapt Alaska, which walks through this. When I came on the job in 2016, there was lots of good resources out there for resilience, but they really didn't apply to Alaska. So the way we approach this from our perspective is we do these workshops first. We create conversation. A community needs to sit down, whether it's a tribe, a tribal government, or a community, just sit down and say, okay, these are the things we're going to focus on. I worked with a community in Southeast Alaska, for example. We went over this for 2 days. We talked about subsistence the first day. things that are important for research, for the subsistence way of life, different, they could do research and monitoring, things like that. Well, the second day we talked about infrastructure. Tribes provide a lot of infrastructure in Alaska. They take the place of cities, municipalities, boroughs. In most places in Alaska, most communities don't have that infrastructure. So the tribe does all the work. And they're the ones that deal with housing, water systems, energy systems, all of those things. And so the other thing that we talked about was like, okay, well, how deep are our pipes buried? Where's our water source? What do we need to think about in terms of landslides? All of those things, the basic physical infrastructure. They're having more smoky days in Southeast Alaska because British Columbia and Yukon burn in the summers. And so, the smoke is coming in, and you've got all these elders that need to stay inside. How do we put air exchangers in houses to provide them fresh air and keep the smoke out? And, all of these things are infrastructure type of things that are just basically about community well-being and health. So, those are the planning things that we can provide a conversation around that. And then it's up to who we're working with, often as tribes, to do the actual monitoring, which is the next step, actually gathering data and producing data products that are useful for the community. Those data products and monitoring can then inform mitigation. Mitigation is really just like fixing a problem. It doesn't actually fix the problem, but it fixes a problem. And then building actually resilient strategies, because the storms aren't going to go away. The inundation's not going to go away. The climate's still going to change, but you can be more resilient. And in doing so, you can actually build better community well-being at the same time. You can do things that actually enhance your community well-being by actually building resilience. Ultimately, though, the final step is adaptation. And adaptation isn't adapting to today. It's when I work with a community, I'm like, I want you to think about what your community is like for your grandchildren. Because especially in Indigenous communities in Alaska, family is so important. People want their kids to live there. They want to create a space where their kids can have the same lifestyle that they had. A lifestyle that's really important and is really connected to the land and to the culture. And so adaptation is thinking 2 generations down the road. I always ask communities, I want you to think about what you want your community to look like in 50 years, not today. And let's work towards that. But in that process, the one thing we always do is we create lists of things that, here's some resilience and adaptation strategies you can have. I always tell people, put the easy ones at the top so you can have some wins. You can have some easy things, and then you can work your way to the harder things. So,
you're talking about subsistence communities. Can you talk a little bit what exactly that means? Because when I'm hearing that, I'm thinking, little village that all they do is they fish for salmon in the summer, late summer, and then I'm just thinking of the stereotype maybe. So is there can you just explain that a little bit more about what does that actually look like? And I know it could probably look different from Southeast Alaska to Northwest Alaska, but
this is an answer I could probably give you. So in my previous life, I was a researcher and then regional manager at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and in the Division of Subsistence. And so I did everything from being an unpaid graduate intern to leaving there as the regional manager for all of Southern Alaska. Now, that said, very small part of the Department of Fish and Game, a few social scientists and a sea of biologists and biometricians and others. So we had we had 2 regions, North and South. That was it. So the cool thing about that is that it gave me an opportunity to work in places from the Aleutian Islands to Southeast Alaska to the interior. I spent a lot of time in Bristol Bay over the years. So I got to learn about all the differences in the subsistence way of life across these spaces. So across Alaska, um, the harvest of wild resources is incredibly important for residents. Here in Anchorage, where I live, the average person, if you take the total harvest and you average it out, the average person probably harvests about 20 pounds of wild food per year. That's not very much. If you look at rural communities across the state, even in South Central Alaska, that goes up to like 150 pounds per person. So, and that's just that's a rural community in South Central Alaska. If you go down to Southeast, it could be anywhere from 100 to 200 pounds per person. If you get outside of some of the core urban areas like Juneau or Ketchikan, but as you start to move your way up the coast of Alaska, you get to Bristol Bay and it's 200 pounds per person. You keep going, it's three. And I've worked in communities in the interior of Alaska that rarely get flights in, and they're very small. There's usually like 10 or 12 households. They were 1,000 pounds per person of wild food. So, and that's edible weight. So that's not the entire animal. Like a moose is around 500 pounds of meat. Salmon could be anywhere from 4 to 6 pounds. You know, and so we average all that out. Berries and plants, 5 to 10% of their overall harvest, and they don't weigh a whole lot, and they take a lot of effort to harvest. So the point is that it's not just like, things that are easy to get. I mean, this is averaged out across the state, over, like, in some communities, it's 15 to 17 different types of wild resources they're harvesting in a year. Now, you look at my own family, that's maybe 2 or 3 different kinds of fish or salmon and blueberries. That's 4. So you can think about communities where the diversity is massive and the harvest is massive. I would say across the state, it's about 300 pounds per person. If you average it out, probably half of that is salmon. But it's very diverse depending on if you're in Southeast Alaska, where the focus is salmon, non-salmon fish, a few deer, to Bristol Bay, where it's moose, caribou, salmon, again, and other types of, and a wide diversity of resources. Typically, Yupik communities, in the past and in the present, harvest wide diversity of resources across Bristol Bay and the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. And then you go up to the North Slope, and it gets even higher because marine mammals come in very large packages. So, it just really depends. They're hunting whales and seals, and Inuit communities across the Arctic are really marine mammal focused. So yeah, it's just this diversity across the state. But the one thing to remember about that is it's not just harvesting food for putting away in the freezer. I mean, that's part of it. As Alaskans, we all feel this like urge in the fall, like, do I have enough in the freezer? Like, it's this anxiety we have. It's not just that. There is that food security aspect, but it's in Alaska Native communities, it's about harvesting with your family, with your community, harvesting in places where your family has harvested for generations, since time immemorial, and continuing that practice. It's more about, in anthropology, we say it's the praxis of it. It's the actual like act of doing it really connects you with your family. It connects you to the land. It connects you to the waters, and it connects you to the resources that you have a spiritual connection to. The reciprocity that is between humans exists between humans and animals. And it's all part of a system that has maintained people for thousands of years and allowed them to be not to survive in the Arctic, but to thrive and be successful.
So, as you mentioned, you're from there, but it kind of sounds like a dumb question, but like, what is it that made you so interested in the ocean, in the coast, in anthropology? Is that just from growing up in it and you're like, I need to know more about this, I need to learn more about each of these communities, like there's like the wide variety of these communities? Was that it, or was there something that sparked that interest for you?
Well, I can give you the answer I give to my students. So I teach anthropology at Matsu College, which is part of the University of Alaska Anchorage, and it is close by to where I grew up. When my family moved there when I was 10 from Anchorage, there were 17,000 people in the entire Matsu borough, which is the size of West Virginia. And today there are 117,000. So it's big. And when I was growing up, we lived back behind a field. And what I didn't realize is that the woods that I used to run in as a kid, I loved to trail run. And I ran in as a kid, ran right by a place called Benta. And Benta was the site of Chief Wasila's town site. He was the Dena'ina Athabaskan Keshka, or chief, lack of a better term. It's loosely translated as rich man. And these weren't inherited titles. You gained this through your own charisma, being a good provider, things like that. He was the one who had, and that was his village site. And people respected him so much when the railroad came through in 1917, came through Wasilla, and Wasilla was formed as a town, that they named the town after him. And I didn't know any of this. So it was a very, I grew up surrounded by people that looked like me. It was a little rural. I drove a truck. I had a snow machine. That was the lifestyle back then. We rode a lot of ATVs and things like that. But that was Alaska to me. So I've lived in South America. I've lived in France, and then I lived for 2.5 years in West Africa in a subsistence farming community in a mud hut in the middle of nowhere, close to the edge of the Sahara Desert in the Sahel region. And I became absolutely fascinated by how people and their culture interacted with the environment, and how that culture transformed the environment, and how the environment itself was reciprocal in transforming the culture. And I was really fascinated by that. Like how did the blacksmiths who ran all the secret societies in the village and the farmers, like how did they interact? Because they had to rely on one another, even though sometimes they didn't like each other. But they had to survive. They had to work together. And how did this whole system work? It was absolutely fascinating to me. So I had a degree in Russian history from the University of Alaska Anchorage, super useful for planting trees in the desert in Africa. But when I came back to Alaska, I got into the brand new master's program at the University of Alaska Anchorage in applied cultural anthropology, and I was their first graduate. So I immediately went into that program, graduated 2.5 years later, and I got a job at Department of Fish and Game in their subsistence division as I think I mentioned earlier, unpaid graduate intern, and then I worked my way up into a position and kept going and helped build the program in Southern Alaska. And I was able to rediscover a lot of that. I was able to discover the vast diversity of cultures in Alaska and the vibrancy of each of these places, and how culture really drives like how people interact with their environment, and how that environment is also reflective in the culture itself. And so that's why it was fascinating for me to work from like Southeast Alaska, where Tlingit culture is so dominant in the community, where to other places where you just don't really notice it as much, like here in South Central, but it's so much still a part of our community. And some of that has to do with, my own family. We benefited economically from the wild resources of Alaska. And so my family were guides for sheep and polar bear. And so that drove a lot of, in the 1950s and 1960s and into the early 70s until the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, that really drove a lot of the efforts that we had in that. And we also worked in oil and gas, and you couldn't not work in oil and gas in Alaska. And so in some ways, I feel like I'm kind of giving back to my state and my community by the work that I do, and trying to work in communities across Alaska and trying to just build better community well-being and resilience.
I think off those conversations and when we're talking about, climate resilience and, some pretty heavy stuff to me, you don't do this and you don't, I don't know. I'm sure it can be difficult to live in Alaska, especially in these subsistence communities. So you kind of have to have that hope about the future. And so, or how is it that this hope or optimism and thinking about what we're going to do to continue our way of life, as you mentioned, how does that incorporate into your day to day, if it does, or is it just kind of something like, someone we just recently talked to is like, there is no work without hope. Like, if I didn't have hope for the future, why am I doing any of this? So yeah, I guess how does that like work its way into your work and especially within the local indigenous cultures?
I don't know if I've ever thought about that. Like, what I see right now is a recognition of building resilience is important. And I think over the last 10 years, I think communities in Alaska have really embraced that. They've embraced that realization that these things are going to happen and they're going to get worse. But for me, the hope is about, the fact that these communities will still be there in 20 years. And that the people that I work with today that are youth, like one of our recent workshops, we asked that they bring youth with them because they are our future. And one of the communities that came was Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories. And luckily I had an opportunity to go there 2 years before with a group of students that I was hosting with a collaboration with the University of Laval in Quebec. And we took some students up there and I got to visit this community and also see like how organized and supported communities in Canada are compared to communities in Alaska. And these kids had done like a music video about their hope for the future and climate, and don't leave us out of the conversation because we are the future. And it was beautiful. It was like, it just such great beauty of like, they're embracing the landscape, embracing their space, embracing living there, and that they want to stay there and they want this to be their place. And I think, working in, one of my favorite things to do is to go into classrooms when we're working in a community, or we held a barbecue in Chivac, which is on the YK Delta, and we had like 300 people show up, and I didn't get a lot of chance to talk to people because I was in the kitchen the whole time. But actually like seeing all these kids come through, and like seeing the cross country team go out for a run and things like that, and then seeing the Chupik classes that they had, and like how engaged the kids were, like in the community, in their culture, in doing activities and all of these things. It's, they just really embrace life there. And watching the kids break up, play in the slush and the snow, and run their snow machines across the water, and and just being outside and playing and just enjoying, being outside. And I see that, and I see that joy that people have of living in rural Alaska. It's a real joy. It's a joy of people that are so connected to their space, to their place, and to their culture. It's something sometimes we don't see in urban Alaska, but we do embrace it in some ways. The workshop we just held this week was on biocultural heritage in Anchorage. And it was about people like myself who were born here and newcomers to Anchorage, and why this is such a wonderful place to live, because we have so much green space and so much connection to nature here. And it's why we live here. So you can look at it from an indigenous perspective in a community where people have really embraced the lifestyle of living in a rural community because that's where they come from. I mean, that's what they know. And we recently did a short, well, actually, we did a film on this, and some of the hunters that were there. I see a lot of hunters and others that leave the community. They go away for a while. They live in urban Alaska, and then they come back, and that's where they want to be. Like once they've had their career, that's where they go because it's the lifestyle. It's the way they want to live. To urban space like we have here in Anchorage, where most of the population lives, we also embrace that. It's still part of our lifestyle here. Being able to, take your truck into an area and go hunting, or go for a mountain bike in the mountains. I do a lot of cross country skiing, um, and we have two of the best ski parks in the country in Anchorage. This is cross country ski town. And so, we embrace that. And so it doesn't matter where you are in the state. I think as Alaskans, we really embrace the place that we are. And we have hope that our children will embrace it too. My own son came home after 2 years of college in Oregon. And he's like, Dad, I don't want to be down there. I want to be in Alaska.
When someone comes to you and say like, hey, I'm struggling with everything, like what is it that I can do that you think would help me get over that, like emotionally, but also like what can I do to help? And so what is your answer to that, whether that's in Alaska or wherever they're at? What can people do to help?
I think the thing that I always tell students is that make your passion your profession. Like be happy with what you do. So for me, it was all about, I was just fascinated. And yes, I have a little bit of an ability to do that because I was educated in a middle class background. I was always told, I put myself through college mostly, but I was always told you could do anything. My father was a guidance counselor, so that helps. And my parents were very encouraging. So, that's what I always, I had the ability to do that. But even all the students I work with, it's like, make your passion your profession. You can do these kind of things. Like find out what you really want to do. And, I bring in a lot of undergraduate students. It's one of the reasons that I worked with my colleagues to start this undergraduate fellowship. And there's lots of fellowships out there. But we really focused on like trying to get students who may not be going down that road, who were, to think about the marine and coastal sciences as an opportunity, especially when they come from communities where that's not typically, one, going to college is not typically what you do, or two, going into the sciences is not typically what you do. We really started that because we wanted to encourage students to do that. I highly encourage students to finish their degree and go on to graduate school. And I hate to say it, but that's, if you want to get a job in the work that you want to do, you really need to do that. Sometimes you can be successful without it, but there's a second part of that. It's just intellectual curiosity. Like it's the process of learning. And I always feel like I am a constant learner. The reason I got a PhD was because it wasn't so that people would call me doctor. It's because I didn't feel like I knew enough. Like I was in charge of a research program, and I was like, I need to be better at my job. So I need more tools in my toolbox to actually just be better at my job. And it's because I wanted to do all this great work, but I felt like I just needed more tools. So I encourage students to do that. Learning is just such a wonderful thing. And, we need to consistently learn. And that's why we should be getting educations, not just so that you can check a box. It really should be about like doing it for the value of learning and so that you can do the work that you want to do, and have that profession that is really your passion.
Davin, thank you so much. We didn't hit a lot of the things I wanted to talk about, just because you do so much. I wanted to talk about your time in South America, France, and Africa, and the Peace Corps. But maybe we'll have to do a follow up, like I said earlier about your disaster science. So
Yeah.
But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And, this is really fascinating work. And like I said, you're doing really good work. And like the whole point of it is to help these communities. And so that's what's so cool about it. And we'd love to highlight it, and anything we can do to help share and social media, whatever, we will do it. And, like I said, hopefully we can get up there and visit in person and go see Alaska.
Sure. Yeah. If you do come through Anchorage, let me know.
Thank you again to Dr. Holen for talking with us. Alaska is such an important place. We really appreciate the time and love the work that he and his team are doing. So please check out adaptalaska.org. Producers are Austin Parker and Geoff Leech. Host is Austin Parker. Music was provided by Picture Book Studios. Thanks for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe if you want to help. I'll talk to you next time.